The Italians created the first all-metal monoplane fighter in their history, but their own pilots forced them to cut the cockpit back open because they were used to the wind in their face on old biplanes. Meet the Fiat G.50 Freccia, the aero that was hopelessly obsolete even before its first flight. How did a fighter with a weak 80-40 horsepower engine and the speed of a turtle manage to become a formidable weapon in the freezing skies of Finland against Soviet aces? And why did Italy stubbornly continue to build this outdated monoplane while Germany produced advanced Messerschmitts? Let's not drag this out. Now we will break down the anatomy of this amazing half-plane. Let's begin. 1935 was a turning point for world aviation. German designer Willy Messerschmitt took his Messerschmitt 109 fighter into the air, a machine that in just a few years would become one of the most recognizable in history. The British were working on the Spitfire. Soviet engineers were preparing new high-speed monoplanes. But in Italy at the same time, the country's air force was still flying the Fiat CR-32 biplanes, small, agile, but hopelessly outdated machines with two open wings and non-retractable landing gear. These planes performed well in the skies of Spain in the late 30s, but it is one thing to defeat the same outdated equipment of an enemy. It is a completely different thing to prepare for a clash with a new generation of monoplanes. The Italian military leadership was in no hurry to change. While other countries switched to all-metal high-speed machines, the Italians continued to modernize biplanes. In 1939, the Fiat CR-42 Falco entered service, the last and most perfect Italian biplane. A beautiful, maneuverable, but already morally outdated machine. Why did it turn out this way? One of the reasons sounds surprisingly simple and slightly insulting. Italian generals believed in maneuverability more than in speed. They remembered the light, nimble biplanes of the First World War and believed that a dogfight would always be at close range, turns, twists, a duel at short distance. German and British engineers reasoned differently. They relied on speed and powerful engines, on the fact that the outcome of a clash in the sky would be decided in a matter of seconds and not in long circles around each other. The difference was felt even visually. On the airfields of Germany and Britain, narrow, swift silhouettes with closed cockpits and retracted landing gear were lined up. On Italian airfields at that same moment stood machines whose appearance had almost not changed since the previous decade. Double wings, an open cockpit, wheels sticking out, as if the machine itself belonged to a simpler and slower era. This divergence in approaches would cost Italian aviation dearly. But the changes still began. In 1936, Italian designers finally set about developing a modern monoplane, the very one that would later receive the name Aero. One question from the very beginning hung in the air, like smoke over an airfield. Would the Italian industry be able to create a machine capable of competing on equal terms with the best designs in Europe? The answer turned out to be much more complicated than anyone could have assumed then, and the first obstacle arose not in the blueprints of the fuselage or wing, but where it was least expected. When Italian engineers sat down at the blueprints for the new fighter, they faced a problem that could not be solved with a single stroke of a pencil. The Germans already had a proven Daimler-Benz inline engine. The British had the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Both were stretched along the axis of the aircraft. Both gave a narrow, streamlined nose and minimal air resistance at high speed. Italy did not have such an engine. The country's industry simply did not produce inline aircraft engines of the required power in sufficient quantities. Years could have been spent developing their own analog, but there was no time left. Competitors were already preparing production machines for release, and Italian biplanes were becoming obsolete with each passing month. And then the designers made a decision that at first glance looked like a retreat, but in reality turned out to be a forced discovery. Instead of an inline engine, the new fighter received a Fiat A74 radial engine. 14 of its cylinders were located not in a row, but in a circle, like pedals around a central axis. Because of this, the nose of the machine turned out to be wide and round, completely unlike the narrow, elongated noses of German and British fighters. The power of this engine was 840 horsepower, less than that of competitors, but quite enough to lift a light and compact fighter into the air. And the radial engine had an unexpected advantage that engineers did not think of right away. It turned out to be much more survivable than its inline counterpart. Even if one of the 14 cylinders stopped working, The other 13 continued to pull the machine forward, and the pilot got a chance to reach the airfield, where an inline engine with a damaged block would have stopped completely. For comparison, the German Daimler-Benz inline engine under the hood of the Messerschmitt produced already more than 1,000 horsepower. A gap of almost 200 horsepower at the start of the project is not a trifle, but an initial loss in a race that Italian engineers had to run literally with a weight on their leg. The Italian engine also sounded different. An inline engine gives a smooth, pulling hum. A radial engine gives a rougher, rumbling sound with a characteristic vibration that experienced mechanics distinguished by ear from any other engine on the airfield, even before the machine appeared from behind the clouds. It was this forced compromise with the power plant that determined the entire appearance of the future fighter. Its wide nose, its proportions, its very recognizable shape. And that is why the machine received a name that was supposed to sound fast and swift: Aero. The name is beautiful, promising, but in the end, this machine would severely lack truly high speed, and why this happened, we will find out very soon. The Fiat plant in those years already had its recognized mestre of aircraft construction, Celestino Rosatelli. It was in his honor that the biplanes of the CR series received their name, which stands for Caccia Rosatelli, that is, Rosatelli Fighter. For 20 years, this designer determined the appearance of Italian combat aircraft, and his biplanes were considered the standard of lightness and maneuverability. And so, in the midst of this dominance, the management of the plant entrusts the development of a fundamentally new machine, not to the recognized mestre, but to a young engineer named Giuseppe Gabrielli. He had to create what Rosatelli had never built, an all-metal monoplane with retractable landing gear, a machine of a completely different engineering philosophy. Gabrielli began work on the project back in April 1935. Later, when the Italian Ministry of War issued official requirements for the new fighter, the project had to be significantly finalized under these conditions. What makes this story truly interesting, Gabrielli did not go down the most obvious path. Some Italian design bureaus in those years willingly relied on foreign experience and borrowed other people's technical solutions. Gabrielli chose another path. He designed the machine from scratch, starting from what the Italian industry could actually produce, from available materials to that very radial engine we talked about in the last section. A bold decision. The young engineer, in essence, staked his own reputation in a company where for 20 years the main authority was a completely different person. The first prototypes were built all summer and autumn of 1936. The test program was not easy. There were also severe accidents. During one of the high-speed flights at low altitude, one of the machines lost control and crashed. Aviation in those years was generally a risky business, and testing new, not yet adjusted equipment even more so. But despite these difficulties, on June 9, 1938, Gabrielli's fighter won the competition of the Ministry of War under the name Fighter No. 1. And this despite the fact that in speed it was inferior to its main competitor, the Mach-E C-200 machine. The military was won over precisely by the maneuverability of the new machine. Today, the name of Giuseppe Gabrielli is known to few outside a narrow circle of specialists in aviation history. But it was this man who gave Italy its first truly modern fighter, and the shadow of his legendary predecessor finally began to recede. The original design of the Aero assumed a completely closed cockpit, a glazed canopy that was supposed to improve the streamlining of the machine and protect the pilot from the oncoming airflow. From an engineering point of view, the solution looked flawless, but the people who were to fly the new machine had their own opinion. Italian pilots in those years grew up on biplanes with open cockpits. Wind in the face, full view in all directions, a feeling of direct contact with the sky. For them, this was not just a habit, but part of the pilot's craft itself. They met the closed canopy of the new machine without any enthusiasm. The claims turned out to be not a whim, but quite specific technical complaints. The cockpit canopy opened slowly and inconveniently. In an emergency situation, there was simply no time for this. The glazing material was of poor quality. From dust and sand, scratches quickly appeared on it, and the surface itself easily became covered with small cracks. In flight, exhaust gases from the closely located radial engine often penetrated inside the cockpit. And most disappointingly for the designers, despite all the tricks with aerodynamics, the view from the closed cockpit turned out to be worse than that of biplanes with an open cockpit, to which the pilots were accustomed. One after another, the test pilots began to complain, and some even flew with the canopy open, simply ignoring the designer's idea. Gabrielli and his team had to go for a review of the project. As a result, the production machines received a compromise option, a semi-open cockpit. The rear part of the canopy remained fixed, and the front section slid back, leaving the pilot's head partially in the open air, almost like on a biplane of former years. From the point of view of pure aerodynamics, this was a step back. Additional air resistance, extra wind whistle in the cockpit, a certain loss of speed, all these costs were well understood by the engineers themselves. But the Italian Air Force was formed by people, and not just by calculations of blowing in a wind tunnel, and the opinion of the pilots in the end outweighed pure theory. This story tells more about the creation of military equipment than it seems at first glance. One can design a form that is ideal from the point of view of physics, but if the person at the controls does not trust it, all mathematics loses its meaning. Gabrielli learned this lesson already on his first major project, and it would not be the last compromise for the constructor on this machine. After all, while there were disputes around the shape of the cockpit, much more fundamental questions were being decided around the very airframe of the future fighter, its dimensions, its weight, its very design. Let's put aside for a minute the disputes about the cockpit and engines, and just look at the machine itself, how it turned out in metal. The length of the aero was approximately 7.8 meters, slightly shorter than a modern school bus. The wingspan was about 11 meters. This distance is approximately equal to the length of 2 cars parked one after the other. The height of the machine when parked was about 3 meters, that is, about the height of a one-story house. Figures in themselves say little until a comparison appears. Place a modern small business jet next to an Italian fighter of 1937, and the difference in dimensions will turn out to be not so huge. For a combat machine of the late 30s, the aero was compact and incredibly neat-looking. An empty machine, without fuel, without ammunition, without a pilot, weighed about 1,960 kilograms. If, quite simply, this is approximately the weight of 1.5 small cars. With a full tank, ammunition, and a pilot in place, the weight increased to slightly over 2,400 kilograms. For comparison, the British Spitfire weighed noticeably more, and the German Messerschmitt 109 in combat configuration also exceeded the Italian machine in weight. The Aero remained one of the lightest combat machines of its class in the European sky of those years. On the ground, the machine looked almost fragile next to its heavier peers. A narrow, retractable landing gear, a compact, rounded nose, a short, almost toy-looking fuselage. But it was this visual lightness that deceived the spectators at the airfield. In the air, the same machine turned out to be one of the most reliable fighters of its generation. And this lightness was not an accident, but a direct consequence of all the decisions we have already talked about. A compact radial engine instead of a heavy inline one, an all-metal but economically designed fuselage structure. All this together gave a machine that did not strike with power on paper, but was distinguished by rare maneuverability in the real sky. It was this lightness, and not speed, that would become the main trump card of the fighter in the first aerial battles. The pilots who mastered the machine noted its responsiveness to control. The Aero reacted to the movements of the stick almost instantly, turned in a tighter circle than many of its contemporaries, and forgave the pilot many mistakes in piloting. But lightweight is a derivative of something even more important, from that very engine that beats in the nose of the fuselage. It is worth looking under the hood a little deeper than we did before, and find out what actually happened inside the 14 cylinders of the Aero during flight. Let's return to where the whole compromise with speed began, to the engine. The official name of this engine sounds like this: Fiat A74 RC38. Not the most harmonious name, but behind these letters and numbers lies a completely understandable engineering logic. The letters RC mean the presence of a reduction gear and a supercharger, a device that additionally pumps air into the cylinders at a high altitude, where it naturally becomes more rarefied. And the number 38 is the altitude in hundreds of meters at which the supercharger provided the full power of the engine. In other words, this particular engine was tuned by engineers to work most effectively precisely at an altitude of about 3,800 meters, approximately where most of the aerial battles of that era unfolded. The engine itself was 2-row, 14 cylinders located in 2 circles of 7 pieces, one behind the other. This layout allowed squeezing solid power into a relatively compact body in length, although it required a wider diameter than single-row engines. An interesting detail, Italian engineers did not invent this scheme from scratch. The design was based on the developments of the American company Pratt & Whitney, which Fiat obtained under license and modified for its own needs and production standards. From a much more modest 7-cylinder Fiat A70 engine, a whole family of increasingly powerful radial engines was gradually born, and the A74 became one of the most successful representatives of this line. The output power was 840 horsepower at 2,500 revolutions per minute. The engine was cooled by a stream of oncoming air that passed between the fins on the cylinder heads, without a single kilogram of water or antifreeze in the system. Such a solution had its own practical logic. With an inline liquid-cooled engine, one damage to the radiator or pipeline is enough for the engine to quickly overheat and stall right in flight. With a radial air-cooled engine, such a vulnerability simply did not exist. There was nothing to leak, nothing to boil. Ground technicians also liked this engine more. Fewer tubes, fewer seals, fewer reasons for morning swearing at the airfield before flight. Field maintenance was reduced to simpler and more understandable procedures, and the design itself allowed for improvised repairs right in the field, away from factory workshops, a quality that was especially valued where this machine was only to go to serve. This same engine, by the way, also stood on the Fiat CR42 Falco biplane, which we have already mentioned, and on another Italian fighter of those years, the Mach-E C200. Three completely different machines, the same heart under the hood. The power of the engine is converted into thrust only through one node, the propeller. On the Aero, there was a three-bladed metal propeller jointly developed by the Italian company Fiat and the American Hamilton, with a diameter of exactly 3 meters. The blades were variable. The pilot could change their pitch directly in flight, adjusting the propeller to different modes: acceleration, climb, cruise flight. With this propeller and engine, the fighter accelerated at an altitude of about 5,000 meters to a speed of about 470 to 472 kilometers per hour. At the ground, where the air is denser and creates more resistance, the speed dropped to about 400 kilometers per hour. A climb to 5,000 meters took the machine about 6 minutes. For a fighter of its time, the performance was quite functional. But let's be honest and compare these figures with the main German competitor. The Messerschmitt 109, at comparable altitudes, accelerated to 570 kilometers per hour and above, almost 100 kilometers per hour faster than the Italian machine. The British Hurricane, which the Aero met more than once in the sky, also often simply ran away from the Italian fighter on a straight line. Speed turned out to be the real Achilles heel of this machine. Neither maneuverability nor engine survivability could completely compensate for this difference in a confrontation where the opponent at any moment was able to simply break away on a straight line, or, conversely, attack from above at speed, leaving the Italian pilot no room for maneuver. At the same time, in a dive, the Aero behaved quite confidently, and on turns at medium and low altitudes, it remained exceptionally obedient and control. The pilots noted that the machine literally follows the hand, reacting to the slightest movement of the control stick. The problem lay precisely in the horizontal speed on a straight line, and not in the behavior of the machine as such. The difference in speed also dictated the very tactics of using the machine. Italian pilots had to build a fight not on straight chases, but on sharp maneuvers, on attempts to impose a close turn on the enemy, where the advantage in speed of the opponent ceased to be of decisive importance. And yet, figures on paper are not the whole truth about the machine. Speed does not decide everything in an aerial battle, and experienced Italian pilots knew how to turn the weak sides of their equipment into a tactical advantage. But more on that later when we get to specific combat episodes. In the meantime, let's return to the very first and most exciting day in the life of this machine. The day when all these figures had to be tested not on paper, but in the real sky. The construction of the first two prototypes began in the middle of the summer of 1936 at the CMA SA plant, a subsidiary of Fiat in the town of Marina di Pisa on the Tuscan coast. It was there, and not at the main plant in Turin, that the airframes of most production machines were subsequently assembled. The morning of February 26, 1937, was special for Gabriele's engineering team. After months of calculations, disputes about the cockpit, and forced compromises with the engine, the prototype fighter was finally rolled out onto the airfield for its first flight. The test pilot took his place in the cockpit. The Fiat A74 engine started and began to gain revolutions per minute, and that very rough, rumbling sound of the radial engine we talked about in the previous section echoed over the airfield for the first time on this particular machine. Takeoff run, liftoff, and here an all-metal machine with landing gear retracting in flight lifted off from the Tuscan field for the first time. The engineers on the ground watched this flight in silence. No one spoke aloud the obvious, that behind each of them stood months of sleepless nights over blueprints, and ahead, minutes in which calculations would either be confirmed in the air or fall apart along with the reputation of the entire project. The prototype completed the first circle over the airfield smoothly, without complaints, and returned safely to the runway. The significance of this moment can hardly be overestimated. For the first time in the history of Italian aircraft construction, a truly modern fighter rose into the sky, an all-metal monoplane with landing gear retracting in flight, leaving behind a whole era of biplanes with their wooden and fabric structural details. For comparison, at that moment, the German Messerschmitt 109 had already been in the air for more than a year, which means Italian designers had to not set a trend, but rapidly catch up. Testing continued for the next year. As we already mentioned in the third section, the program went not without difficulties and loss of equipment. But in general, the machine showed itself well enough to win the official competition of the Ministry of War under the name Fighter No. 1 on June 9, 1938, and get a path into mass production. Early production copies began to arrive in the Italian Air Force in early 1939. The prototype that flew on February 26, 1937, gave start to far from a single machine, but to a whole family, which was destined to disperse through the factory floors in quantities significantly exceeding the modest two prototypes. Not much time passed from the first flight to the assembly line. Serial production of the fighter was deployed immediately on two sites. The main Fiat Aviazione plant in Turin assembled part of the machines, and the main load was taken by the CMASA subsidiary plant in the coastal town of Marina di Pisa. It was there, if you remember, that the first prototypes were built. The production rate increased gradually, rather than in a jump. In 1937, besides two prototypes, the plant did not have time to deliver a single production machine. The technology was being adjusted. In 38, about 14 copies were built. In 39, already 75. And in 1940, when the fighter finally took wing in the Italian Air Force, the plant delivered 153 machines in 1 year. In total, the basic version of the fighter was sold in a circulation of about 244 copies. But the history of production does not end there. Already in 1940, an improved modification entered the shops, the Aero Bis, with an increased fuel capacity and, accordingly, a much greater flight range. It was this version that became the most massive in the fighter's family, by various counts. From 420 to 440 copies of it were built, right up to 1943. There were also much rarer options. A two-seat trainer modification with dual controls and removed armament, about 100 copies used in flight schools to train new pilots. A single prototype for carrier-based operation, which did not go further than one built machine. And even a single copy with a much more powerful engine of 1,000 horsepower, a kind of engineering experiment that remained in the singular, not receiving continuation in the series. If you put all the versions together, the final figure fluctuates depending on the source, from slightly over 700 to about 830 built machines. The scatter in calculations is not surprising. The archives of military plants of that era have not been fully preserved, and part of the machines transferred from one accounting category to another as repairs and upgrades progressed. Be that as it may, for the Italian aviation industry of that time, this was a very solid run by the standards of the country, comparable to the production volumes of many European fighters of its class and time. Factory floors in Turin and on the Tuscan coast worked practically without stopping for several years in a row. Though while the assembly line continued to stamp out airframes, the designers already clearly understood the age of this particular machine turned out to be not so long. Remember that same forced compromise from the very beginning of our story? The lack of a powerful inline engine in Italy? So the irony of fate is that the solution to this problem put an end to the further career of the Aero. In 1941, one of the prototypes of the machine received an experimental power plant, the German Daimler-Benz DB601 inline engine, the same class of engines that stood on the Messerschmitt. On tests in Turin, this version escalated to 570 km per hour, closely approaching the performance of the main German competitor, the gap with which we spoke about several sections earlier. This single copy clearly proved an obvious thing. All this time, it was the engine. Give the Italian designers a suitable inline engine earlier, and the entire history of the Aero could have turned out completely differently. But this version was never put into production. By that time, work on a fundamentally new machine was already in full swing in Turin, and after tests, the only built prototype was simply disassembled for parts. But by the time this lesson was finally learned, Giuseppe Gabrielli was already working on the next project. Italy received a license to produce a much more powerful German engine, the Daimler-Benz DB605, which on Italian plants was produced under its own designation, Fiat RA1050RC58 Tifone, and developed already 1,475 horsepower, almost twice as much as the modest 840 horsepower of the Aero's radial engine. The new fighter, based on this engine, received the name G.55 Centauro. It accelerated to 620 kilometers per hour at an altitude of about 7,400 meters, and these were already indicators capable of competing on equal terms with the best machines of the enemy. The Centauro entered service with the Italian Air Force in the middle of 1943, literally a few months before Italy left the main conflict. The fate of both machines turned out differently, and in this there is something truly human. The Aero, born as a forced compromise with limited resources, was gradually leaving the stage. Serial production of the basic version and the improved Aero bis ceased by 1943. Nevertheless, the machine did not disappear from service instantly. Individual copies continued to serve in minor roles, and in some places in frontline units, right up to May 1944, although in a constantly decreasing number. She was not the best. She was simply the first, and this, strangely enough, turned out to be her main contribution to the history of Italian aviation. While in Italy continued to gain speed factory conveyor belts, on the Iberian Peninsula had been going on a heavy internal conflict for several years. Italy provided direct support to the forces of General Francisco Franco, and as part of this support, the newest and most modern equipment was sent abroad from time to time, including to test it in real conditions, and not only on test sites at home. In January 1939, it was the Aero's turn. About a dozen fresh fighters were sent to Spain to strengthen the Italian aviation mission operating on the side of Franco's nationalists. Thus, the machine, which only recently existed only on paper and in the shops of Marina di Pisa, for the first time found itself where decisions are made, not by designers at the drawing board, but by pilots in seconds in the real sky. The result exceeded expectations. In comparison with the opposing equipment of that theater of military operations, the Italian machine showed itself fast and surprisingly maneuverable. The pilots, who had previously flown biplanes, noted that the new machine literally transformed their tactical capabilities. Higher speed, better weapons, a completely different level of control over the situation in the air. The experience gained by designers and the military on this limited but real test turned out to be invaluable, much more valuable than any laboratory blowings and bench runs of the engine. It was here, and not at the factory airfield, that the machine proved for the first time that it was worthy of a serial future. The Spanish conflict ended in the spring of the same year. But the history of the presence of Italian equipment in this region did not end there. Part of the machines was subsequently transferred directly to the Spanish side, and they continued service already under new insignia, including outside Spain itself and Moroccan possessions. This Spanish episode remains relatively small in scale, a dozen machines, a few months of service. But it was the first real test of all those decisions, compromises, and concessions we talked about throughout the previous sections. A radial engine, a semi-open cockpit, a modest speed by the standards of the era. All this, for the first time, collided not with calculations on paper, but with the harsh practice of real confrontation in the air. Spain became only a warm-up before much more large-scale events. In less than a year, the Italian Aero would find itself in much more severe conditions, at the other end of Europe, where the decisive factor would no longer be the heat of the Iberian summer, but many degrees of frost of the northern winter. At the end of 1939, a Finnish military delegation visited Turin, where tests of a new Italian machine were just taking place. The result impressed the guests, and Finland placed an order for 35 copies of the fighter at once. Delivering the purchased equipment turned out to be much more difficult than buying it. In Europe by that time, large-scale combat operations were already unfolding, and the usual sea route through the ports turned out to be closed. The machines had to be disassembled into parts, carried by rail through northern Germany, and then loaded onto ships to neutral Sweden. Because of these difficulties, the first fighter was assembled in Finland only by the middle of December 1939, and the very last of the 35 ordered copies reached the place only in June 1940. 2 machines were lost right during transport. It was in the midst of these deliveries, in November 1939, that an incident occurred which, in itself, is worthy of separate mention. A Finnish pilot named Tapani Harmaja, testing one of the first received machines, went into a steep dive from an altitude of over 3.5 kilometers, and on the way out of the dive, his instrument showed a speed of 830 kilometers per hour. Ironically, this turned out to be the highest speed indicator ever recorded on an Italian aircraft of that period, and it was achieved not in level flight, but literally by the force of gravity. Finnish pilots quickly mastered the new equipment, although the open cockpit, that same compromise we talked about earlier, in the harsh northern winter pleased them no more than their Italian colleagues in a warm climate. Engineers tried to improve the protection of the propeller from icing, and even tested a ski landing gear for taking off from snow and ice, although most of such improvements did not go into production. The main part of the machines managed to enter service just in time for the final, heaviest battles of the winter campaign of 1939-40 in the area of the Viborg Gulf. And the truly finest hour of the fighter came later, in the summer of 1941, when combat operations between Finland and the Soviet Union resumed with a new force. On June 25, 1941, it was these Italian machines that shot down 13 of 15 Soviet bombers in a single combat episode. And according to the results of all its service in Finland, the fighter earned perhaps the most impressive indicator in its entire career: the ratio of shot-down enemy machines to own losses, by some calculations reached 33-1. For a fighter that at home was considered not the fastest and not the most powerful, this is a fantastic result. But while some copies of the Arrow were freezing on the ice of Karelian lakes, others at this very time were preparing for a completely different climate, much milder geographically, but no less intense in terms of events in the sky. On June 10, 1940, Italy officially entered the main European conflict. For the Aerofighter, this meant transition from the status of a machine tested in local episodes to the status of a full participant in much more large-scale events. The first combat flights of the new campaign took place almost immediately. Squadrons of Arrows accompanied Savoia Marchetti SM.79 bombers in raids on the island of Corsica. The task was routine by the standards of air operations, to cover the slower and more vulnerable machines along the entire route. But a truly serious test awaited the Italian fighter in the autumn of the same year, and much further north of Corsica. In September 1940, a special unit of the Italian Air Force, named the Italian Air Corps, redeployed to Belgium to take part in a large-scale aerial confrontation over the British Isles. It sounds grand. In practice, the Italian contribution to this confrontation turned out to be quite modest. The Arrow, which accelerated at an altitude of maximum to 470-odd kilometers per hour, frankly lost in speed not only to the German machines participating in the same operations, but also to the British interceptors that met it. The British Hurricane, which we have already mentioned more than once in the talk about speed, turned out to be a constant headache for Italian pilots precisely in this sky. It turned out to be faster, had a greater range of flight, and could dictate the terms of the fight practically at any moment of collision. The Italian Air Corps spent several months in Belgium, after which it was recalled back to the homeland. The Italian aviation as a whole, and the Arrow in particular, did not make a significant contribution to the general course of that aerial confrontation, and the Italian aviation historians themselves evaluate this episode quite reservedly today. The problem was not only in the speed of the machine itself. Italian pilots and technicians faced a completely unfamiliar climate. Constant rain, thick fog, and early autumn colds of northern Europe differed strikingly from the sunny sky to which they were accustomed at home. Even elementary technical maintenance in such conditions was significantly more difficult than on Italian airfields. There is a certain regularity in this, which we have already talked about more than once. The sky over the English Channel was a sky of high speeds and short, swift skirmishes at the limit of engine capabilities. Precisely where speed decided, the weakness of the Italian machine manifested itself most clearly and painfully. But this story also had a much more favorable theater of events for the Aero, where not so much speed decided, but the endurance of equipment in extreme climate conditions. From the dampness of the Belgian autumn, let's move to a completely different climatic extreme. From September 1940 and right up to March 1943, the Aero served in North Africa, where instead of rain and fog, pilots and equipment were awaited by hot sand, a scorching sun, and temperature changes from exhausting daytime heat to piercing night desert cold. It was here that the machine finally found itself in conditions for which, we can say, it was born. The semi-open cockpit, which became a concession to pilot habits back at the design stage, suddenly turned from a drawback in the desert climate almost into an advantage. Better ventilation in a hot cockpit was valued much higher than in the snows of Finland or over the cold English Channel. The radial air-cooled engine also showed itself in all its glory here. The lack of a liquid cooling system meant one source of problems less in conditions where any leak or overheating of the radiator due to an air intake clogged with sand could turn into a serious breakdown right in the middle of the desert, tens of kilometers away from the nearest repair base. The maneuverability of the machine, already proven in Spain and Finland, again turned out to be the main trump card in clashes with opposing British equipment in the sky over North Africa. In conditions where battles often slid into prolonged turns at medium altitudes, and not to high-speed duels at the speed limit, the weakness of the Aero in acceleration was not felt so acutely as in the European sky. The reliability of the machine in the harsh conditions of the desert was also noted by the ground technical services themselves. A simple power plant to maintain, an unpretentious landing gear, repairability right in the field, all those qualities that were laid in the machine back at the stage of forced engineering compromises, here finally played exactly the role for which they were originally intended. In the North African sky, Italian pilots on Aeros more than once had to act side by side with German Allied squadrons, together covering ground columns and supply convoys. In the surviving photographs of that period, the Italian fighter often meets in one frame with German twin-engine Messerschmitts, evidence of how tightly intertwined the actions of the Allied air forces were in this theater of events. Special mention is deserved by the sandstorms that regularly covered the airfields of the region. A suspension of the smallest particles of sand, raised by the wind for hundreds of meters, clogged the engine filters, scratched the cockpit glazing, and turned an ordinary flight into a serious test for equipment and the pilot's nerves, even before any meeting with the enemy. The North African campaign stretched over 2.5 years, much longer than any other theater of deployment of this machine. But while prolonged, exhausting battles were going on over the desert, much further south, on a Mediterranean island, the final and most dramatic episode in the biography of this fighter was already beginning to unfold. In July 1943, large Allied forces landed in Sicily. The island became the closest point of Europe at that time, where the Italian Air Force had to defend itself almost on the threshold of its own home, and not somewhere in distant overseas theaters of events. By this time, the Aero was formally considered an obsolete machine. The new G.55 Centauro fighter, which we talked about in the 10th section, was already entering service with active units, but in frankly insufficient quantities to fully take over the defense of such a large sector of the sky. The main burden still lay on the shoulders of much more modest in characteristics, but still numerous Aeros. By the summer of '43, the role of the machine had changed noticeably compared to the beginning of its career. From a pure interceptor fighter, the Aero increasingly turned into a light strike aircraft. Small bombs were suspended under the fuselage, and the machine went not so much to intercept enemy bombers as to attack ground targets, landing craft off the coast, equipment on beachheads, concentrations of forces of the landed enemy. The ratio of forces in the sky over Sicily did not develop in favor of the Italian side. Allied aviation exceeded the defenders of the island in the number of machines and in their technical characteristics, practically in all directions. Italian pilots rose into the air on a machine that, by the standards of 1943, was obsolete for years, and yet continued to perform the assigned tasks. The courage and piloting skills of individual pilots allowed achieving local successes in separate episodes. But to change the general course of events over Sicily, this, of course, could no longer. Too great was the gap in forces. Too little time was left for the obsolete machine to seriously affect the outcome of the entire campaign. Losses among the Italian aviation group over Sicily turned out to be heavy. Many of the machines that rose that summer from Sicilian airfields did not return to base, and the Aero, which participated in these flights on an equal footing with other types of Italian fighters, shared the general fate of the entire group. The Sicilian campaign became, in fact, the last truly large-scale combat use of this machine. Individual copies continued to be in service for almost another year, but it was here, in the sky over this Mediterranean island, that the main chapter of the combat biography of the Italian Aero ended. A chapter that began 7 years earlier with a forced engineering compromise around an engine that was not there. If you look at this whole story as a whole, from the drawing board of 1935 to the Sicilian sky of 1943, something important becomes visible. The Aero was never a record holder. It was inferior in speed to German competitors, inferior in flight range to British rivals, inferior in firepower to almost all machines of its class. And yet she honestly went through practically the entire path of that historical period, which is usually called the era of the formation of modern combat aviation, from the first cautious experiments with monoplanes to full-fledged, mature fighters of the mid-40s. Spain, Finland, the sky over the English Channel, the African desert, Sicily, the geography of her service covered almost the whole of Europe and a good part of the Mediterranean. It is worth remembering what exactly this whole story started with. Not from ambitions to catch up and overtake more developed aviation powers, but from an honest recognition of own limitations. Italy of 1936 simply did not have a powerful inline engine, and instead of waiting years for its appearance, designers led by Giuseppe Gabrielli took what was actually available and squeezed the maximum possible out of it. It is in this, perhaps, that the main lesson of the Aero's history lies, for everyone who is interested in the technology of that era. An engineering solution does not have to be ideal in all parameters simultaneously to turn out to be successful. It is obliged to be suitable for specific resources, for a specific industry, for a specific moment of time in which one has to work. Today, when it comes to the aviation of that era, imagination most often draws the silhouettes of German, British, Soviet, or American machines, the very ones that were produced in thousands and became real icons of their time. Italian equipment in this row almost always remains in the shadow, and the Aero is only one of many such examples, which in our opinion deserve much more close attention than they usually get. Over 800 built copies, a decade and a half of continuous service under a variety of flags, participation practically in all major theaters of events of 1939 to 1945. Not the loudest glory, but a completely deserved place in the history of world aviation and in the history of engineering thought, which knows how to find worthy solutions even where, it would seem, all the trump cards were originally with others. And perhaps, and this is the main value of such stories, behind every legendary name in the history of technology, there is almost always a dozen much less known machines that honestly did their job, rarely getting on book covers and in the headlines of chronicles. The Aero is one of them. And with this story, we wanted to remind that such machines also deserve to be remembered.